There were the fast cars, the glamorous women and the glitz usually associated with Formula One. But what viewers of the Bahrain Grand Prix didn't see were the protests, the baton-wielding police, the tear gas, the shootings and at least one death. That happened just outside the circuit. So should the race have gone ahead? Or is Formula One, headquartered in the building behind me, complicit in human rights abuses in Bahrain? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. Well, amongst the wealthy playboys who enjoyed the Bahrain Grand Prix were members of its royal family. It was these autocratic despots who were involved in the crushing of the Arab Spring in Bahrain last year and the killing and torturing of members of a pro-democracy movement. So why did the people who ran Formula One allow the Grand Prix to go ahead and sanction their rule? Well, before we find out what the public thinks here on the streets of London, here's a short video clip.
The Kingdom of Bahrain has been home to the Formula One Grand Prix since it was first launched there in 2004, making history as the first Formula One race to be held in the Middle East. Last year, the race was cancelled following civil unrest that broke out in Bahrain in February as part of a series of pro-democracy protests across North Africa and the Middle East. This year, despite a feeble human rights record and continued government crackdown on protesters, the race went ahead. Bahrain had promised greater transparency in the wake of an international investigation into the human rights violations that occurred during the uprising in February 2011, but failed to adopt key reforms. No one has been held responsible for the violence involving some 80 deaths and widespread use of torture. Human rights organizations have stated that state violence against those who oppose the Khalifa family rule continues and nothing has changed. In the week leading up to the controversial race, at least 60 protest leaders were imprisoned and police seized dozens in late-night raids. Bernie Ecclestone, the boss of Formula One, claims that sport is sport and politics is of no concern to sportsmen. But the Bahrain royal family showed that to be untrue with its global campaign, featuring the slogan "Unified, One Nation in Celebration." In sharp contrast to what was officially presented, thick black smoke from burning tires was visible from the circuit as the event got underway. Protesters tried to organize a march to Pearl Roundabout, the center of last year's unrest, but activists were quickly arrested. A 37-year-old man was found dead with a gunshot wound and a British journalist was detained along with his local fixer.
Well, I think all sporting bodies have to go to countries which has less than perfect human rights record. But you cross the line when the government of any country is actually using the sport as part of the mechanism of suppression or the mechanism to infringe human rights.
Meanwhile, the hunger strike of Abdul Hadi Al-Khawaja, founder of the Bahrain Center of Human Rights, is in critical condition. He is currently in his third month of a hunger strike in protest of his sentence to life in prison for his involvement in last year's uprising.
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking why people thought this year's Bahrain Grand Prix went ahead, and whether or not it has tarnished the image of Formula One.
I think, first of all, Formula One is quite a sophisticated sport, and maybe if it's held in such a context, might break down the professional image that it's had over the past years.
Last year, the Formula One Grand Prix was cancelled in Bahrain because of the repression taking place. This year, things are the same. There's still anti-government protests, but the race went ahead. What kind of image does this give Formula One in your view?
Greedy, in a word. I think you've always got to put people first, rather than governing bodies and governments. I think, and people of the world should actually show solidarity to that.
I was against it, to be honest. I didn't really think they should have gone ahead with it. A lot of issues around, humanity and what could have even happened to the teams, like happened with the football before when the coaches got attacked. So it was a bit dangerous really for the people and globally as well. It looked bad to me that it was sending out the wrong message.
Things are still bad and it's not really that big in the media, in this country, so people don't really know much about it, so therefore there's not really much public pressure on Formula One, so they're just doing things for the money and their image rather than what's right.
Do you think that Formula One, its image has been tarnished at all by this event taking place there, with all the troubles and the protests that are still going on?
I don't think so. I think it's all about the money. It's all about money. It's all about politics. And, when I say politics, there are, hypocrisies and all kinds of stuff going on. So I don't think it's tarnished. They know how to play the game. This will be forgotten.
I think Formula One tried to keep above politics, but unfortunately it can't. And it's integral into what happens in Bahrain. And Bahrain have got a big investment in McLaren, one of the top teams, so it's very difficult.
Why do you think they went ahead this year when it was cancelled last year?
Well, the prince decided that he'd have it, and so that was it. And that's what happened. And it went without any trouble, didn't it, I think?
It's not quite the same because there's been an enormous amount of repression since then. But you can see from all the trouble bubbling up underneath the surface that that's just papering over the cracks. And they went ahead this year because it's all about money.
I think they felt that the amount of disruption was under control. And the other factor, of course, is money.
Last year, the Formula One race was cancelled in Grand Prix because of human rights abuses committed in that country. Little has changed since then, yet it went ahead this year. Why do you think that was?
I think it's a sport. People want to separate the sport from the politics, and the sport prevailed, and that's what I think the owners of the sport wanted to project.
They're probably, obviously they're getting paid millions in sponsorships, so...
Well, those were the views of the people here on the streets of London. Let's now find out what our experts have to say.
I think it's a very dangerous time for Formula One. It's already got a lot of detractors because of the nature of the sport and the fact that it's an elite occupation. Monaco being the pinnacle, a race in New Delhi earlier where you have mass eviction to make way for this. And I think in the context of what's happening in Bahrain, this particular one is really unfortunate. And the idea of trying to paint this as being all about sport and not about politics, I think is disingenuous. So I think if Formula One is serious about its image, it needs to be concerned about the fact that it's going ahead in a region where protests have been sustained since the last cancellation and where we haven't seen any improvement in the human rights situation. Unfortunately, I think the issue of Formula One and sport, it's questionable the extent to which this is really a sport. This is effectively a big business, and I think the business case for holding the race this year is strong. There are all kinds of tenuous links there between the Bahraini regime and a particular Formula One team. There are all kinds of things to be gained by some of the main players, Bernie Ecclestone being prime amongst them. And I think these are the reasons really why there was almost pressure on Formula One to go ahead with this particular race, irrespective really of the situation on the ground. And in this context, it was interesting that last week the statement came out saying that it was safe. Safety is one issue here, but there is a morality, there is a human rights conditions of Bahrainis, and the extent to which the state is failing to respect rights, that is just as important. And I think big business all over the world, whatever kind it is, has to pay attention to these kinds of issues if it's going to get the kinds of consumers it wants to buy its products and buy into its ethos. Bernie Ecclestone last week, I think it was, made a statement saying that he believed that everything was safe in Bahrain and quiet. And I think one of the statements he also made is that he knows some Bahrainis who live there and that everything was fine. That already is an indicator of the kinds of people that Bernie Ecclestone talks to. I don't think Bernie Ecclestone gets anywhere near a Shia protester. I don't think Bernie Ecclestone gets anywhere near the Shia villages. And so the idea that you could paint this as somehow quiet and peaceful is disturbing. And I think the complicity on this really goes further to the drivers as well. Sebastian Vettel, I understand, was called what was happening in Bahrain hype. Now, you need to understand what hype is, and you need to understand what violations are. And I think it's incumbent on all these people, because they are international actors in many ways, it's incumbent on all of these people to understand the consequences of their action. And I think to paint, it's one thing to go ahead and run the Formula One race despite the protest. It's quite another to detract from the protesters' own successes, limited though they may be, in highlighting the violation. And for me, the issue of running the Grand Prix there is exacerbated by the fact that you have people like Bernie Ecclestone and Sebastian Vettel who then go on to downplay the protests, which is really quite shocking.
The main reason for the Formula not gone ahead last year, it is two main reasons. One of them because of it was not safe for the teams who will come to the Bahrain and the fans who will come to see the race, because at that time there were a martial law applied at Bahrain, and most of the streets have been cutted by the demonstrators. And the other things, that the race have been postponed from March 2011 till October. And in October, the team came and said to decide to go ahead or not. But it seemed that when it was in a clash with them annual vacation, and that it will shorten it if it's go to the Bahrain race. For that reason, they came to the decision to cancel it. While this year, I think one of the main reasons have been its factor become a little affected, which is that the demonstration, it is not that wide similar to the previous year, because as you know, that's the Bahraini regime applied a big crackdown against the demonstrators, such of that they asked the Saudi troops to come across the border and support the Bahraini forces. The other things, the Bahraini regime arrest a lot of people, to reach to about 4,000 people, and he evacuated actually the street from the demonstrator, and he used also the military court to sentence a lot of people for life imprisonment or for death imprisonment. All of that harsh type of steps have been made by the regime, affected actually on the number of demonstrators who came this day.
Before the race, Bernie Ecclestone, the miniature supremo who runs Formula One, described Bahrain as quiet and peaceful. Protesters, he said, were just people who had nothing to do on a Sunday. Well, why do you think he said that? And what does the Bahrain regime have to gain from staging a major international event like a Grand Prix?
To give himself a better image, because obviously he knows that's a lie, and people are kicking off about it, and he's trying to a bit of damage limitation.
Bernie Ecclestone, who's the sort of supremo of Formula One, he said that nothing is happening in Bahrain, that it's all sort of quiet and peaceful. Why do you think he said that?
Because he wants to make more money, obviously. It's obviously not okay over there. There's riots all over the place, so it's just a shame, because it's a nice place, you know. I think the people there deserve a better government than the royal family they've got over there running things. It's all about money.
Well, he's misinformed, I think, and it's obviously money again, isn't it? And there's a lot at stake for him. And you know, he has interests, you know, self-interest, you know, as a business.
I think people say what they believe sometimes, or refuse to believe what's going on. So they will say what eases their conscience maybe sometimes. So he genuinely just convinces himself that nothing's going on there.
Why do you think there was so much security then, if there was nothing going on? I mean, there was a huge amount of security outside the race circuit.
Well, they didn't want any fatalities or anything like that happening, you know, and they wanted the thing to go off in the way that it goes off in other countries, I think.
It's quite a pointed question. Obviously, if nothing was going on, they wouldn't need it. So, you know, you can only assume from that and the reports that are happening surrounding the situation that things obviously were going on, and people were dying, or at least it was quite publicised that one person died the day before the Formula One. So
probably it's related to the whole crackdown on the protests in general, and because Formula One carries such a high profile within the world, if the protests were to be associated with what's happening, it would kind of get into the spotlight, and obviously I think everyone higher up wants everything to just go smoothly, and none of the troubles to be shown to the rest of the world.
What do you think the Bahraini regime have to gain from having the Formula One Grand Prix there?
Notoriety, money, more power on the world stage. It's a very small nation. It's only like 1 million population, so I think it's all about them making more for themselves. I don't think it's anything to do with the Shiite minority who are being downtrodden for years.
Selling the image of the country and trying to do it in a very delicate way.
I think it puts them on the global stage all the time, keeps them out there to say, look, this is where we are, and you know, if you're a millionaire, come and live in Bahrain. I don't really see any other reason for it at all.
Well, different views there from the public here on the streets of London. So what do our experts think about this?
The idea of the race going ahead was mooted because of the fact that there were these security clearances, and I think there was a former London Met police inspector who said he felt safer, I think, living in Bahrain than he did in London. Again, I think it depends on where you live. If you live behind erected fences with good security systems, you will feel safe. But that is not the reality in Bahrain. For the vast majority of Bahrainis, that is not what they face. And this idea that you can somehow run events in secure conditions, again, puts an emphasis on security being the only game in town. We're not just talking about security here. We're talking about issues of peace. We're talking about issues of justice. We're talking about issues of order. And all of these need to be balanced. So, yes, of course, you can conduct, you can take a pot of gold and prevent it from being stolen in a slum. But to be able to do that, you're going to have to use some serious muscle. And in the consequence of using that muscle, inevitably people are going to get hurt. So the actual creating of the secure environment to run this race itself is part of the problem and not the solution. Ultimately, I think when you look at what these events bring you, it's clear that they bring you something of an image. They sell a lifestyle. They generate income and funds for your particular country in much the way that the 2012 Olympics will in London. But the extent to which some of these issues can really be adequately considered from a human rights frame is important to bear in mind. Now, in the context of the Formula One, and in the context of the Bahraini regime, there are obviously very close business ties, there are very, very close business links, and it seems that to a certain extent money did the talking here, and that the money essentially said that the Formula One race had to go ahead and everything else was made to fit that particular reality, including all kinds of determinations by various people saying that it was safe. And again, I reiterate, it may have been safe, it still wasn't moral. We have had for the longest time businesses going into places where there was less protection and violating human rights. We are now at a point in time where the world is much more interconnected than it was before, and businesses have to be aware of the consequences of their action. I believe Formula One is complicit in holding this particular Formula One race in Bahrain. I believe Formula One has crossed that particular line and in many ways has raised itself, has left itself open to questions and considerations on the extent to which it's complicit in the regime's violation of human rights. It's no longer, I think, feasible for a corporation or for a business venture of the nature that Formula One is to simply shrug its shoulders and say, we are going ahead as business as usual. It's incumbent on human rights activists to tell us what is going on, and it's incumbent on the state authorities to try and fix the violations that have occurred. Now, in the Bahraini context, we had this very good report published last year, which highlighted the kinds of violations that took place. The Bahraini government accepted that the violations had taken place, yet there has been nothing that's really been done to adequately address these issues that underlie the report. So if you are going to then go ahead 1 year later and run a Formula One race there, knowing what we know now, which by the way we didn't know last year when the race was covered, then you would say that the business, Formula One, knows perfectly well the kind of circumstance it's conducting its race in, and to that extent should be held complicit.
The Bahraini regime was looking before conducting the formula to clean his image, and he think that conducting such of very famous international events, it will help him to reflect its image to the outside. That's everything inside Bahrain is stable and everything is under control, even though the regime did nothing serious on the ground. The Bahraini regime last year when he would like to disparage the demonstrator who have been occupied the Pearl roundabout, he used a big crackdown and with a big mass of power to kill the people and to disappear them, and followed with that big crackdown to dismiss a lot of workers from them places, and the number reached for about 5,000 workers. Out of that workers, people who's working at the circuits itself, and the number of them is what 37 workers. Some of these workers actually have been arrested from the circuits and tortured in the circuits before they have been taken to the jail and later sentenced by the military courts and kept for a while. After that one, the international NGOs as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, in its campaign against conducting the Formula 1 in Bahrain, they raised this issue that certain workers have been tortured inside the circuits itself. The Bahraini regime couldn't stand that's a pretend. For that reason, he came and released all of them just to say, I'm not holding anybody of that one. This circus actually has a bad image for the Bahraini people because it is a place where the Bahraini people have been tortured. If you add it with the other places, look like the youth houses and house stapling. These places, a lot of Bahrain have been tortured. And at that places before have been taken to the police station.
Human Rights Watch has said that Bahrain's regime will try to use the Grand Prix to show the rest of the world that it's business as usual on their island. So is Formula 1 complicit in trying to provide legitimacy to a dictatorial regime? Well, let's find out what the people think on the streets of London.
I think it is complicit, but there again the Bahraini royal family are invited to the Queen's Jubilee in June, so is the British establishment complicit as well? You have to decide for yourself.
Well, Human Rights Watch said that this race, by it taking place, has allowed the rulers to sort of obscure the seriousness of what's been going on. Do you think in that sense that Formula 1 is complicit in a way trying sort of to normalise a dictatorial regime at all? Do you think that's what, in the end, Formula 1 was trying to do by staging the event?
Possibly, yes. I think a large part of the problem is that Bahrain hasn't received the same amount of coverage as other countries that have, in the Arab Spring, the countries that have taken most of the publicity have been, Egypt, Tunisia. So Bahrain's kind of been left on the sidelines a bit.
Obviously, because then now Bahrain can say, oh, well, look, the Formula 1 still came. Obviously, nothing's happening. So Formula 1's done a bad thing there. It's made it seem like it's not as bad as it is, but it clearly is very bad.
I think they are absolutely complicit, because this argument that sport and politics are not connected has been used down the centuries, hasn't it? And we just think about the Springboks and the tour of South Africa during the apartheid regime. Their argument was that sport and politics have got nothing to do with each other. Likewise, the cricket tour of South Africa during the apartheid regime, the Mike Gatting tour, the same arguments were used. It just doesn't hold water, I'm afraid.
I think there's plenty of countries in the world that they can choose to host a Formula 1. There's plenty of countries that could be used as an alternative. I don't think in the current situation there, Formula 1 is the last thing that they need to be concerned with, in my opinion.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.